Welcome to Second Take, the show that focuses on the issues behind the news. Value generation from the assets of South32 in the months ahead of its debut on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange is indicative of the upside potential of the triple-listed BHP Billiton spin-off company. Mining Weekly editor Martin Creamer tells us more. Welcome, Martin.
Thanks, Shannon.
Can you tell us why should investors buy shares in this new spin-off company, South32?
Well, I think the one thing is that they've had like 2 years to prepare for this. So they've got into the assets. They know that they're not going to expand rapidly. They're going to sweat these assets. So they've started value generation very, very early, doing trial runs, stress testing. Now with a changed structure, more regional base, whereas the base for BHP Billiton has been commodity based. So it has, if you look at it in isolation, it would have been quite expensive for South32. So there's an immediate cost-cutting benefit, and you can see how there was a bearishness towards South32 before the listing. A lot of the analysts and a lot of the fund managers were saying, they were worried about this. What was the value going to be? It looked like it was going to come in at a very low value. But what happened is they soon did their calculations, and suddenly, 4 major fund managers turned and said, we recommend this as a buy. Very quickly. And so they started realizing that this is cash generative. And not only that, but a lot of the methods have already been stress tested. So these guys are going to hit the ground running, because of all the preparation. And even though there are a lot of headwinds in terms of commodity prices and everything like that, they were still going to squeeze, cost savings and cash out of this. And that's where your growth would come from, and you don't have to worry about acquisitions or anything else. They could do it right there. And one of the really value accretive things that they've been working on is that, when you've got a mining company, you've got a lot of resources. But when you confirm those resources and they become reserves, that's immediately value accretive. So you can suddenly get an uplift. So there's upside that people are recognizing there. And that's why I think that you saw a slow sort of build-up of response, but then a bit of a flood.
What can South32 get out of these assets that BHP Billiton couldn't?
Well, I think the one thing is that they were unloved assets, not because BHP Billiton didn't want to love them, but because when you've got sort of 96% of your profits coming out of a certain group and suite of assets, you devote a lot of time, management time, and you don't devote the same time to the area that's giving you 4%. So that area that gives you 4% is still a big area, because if you look at it now, South32 is the 3rd biggest mining company listed on the Australian Stock Exchange. So it's fairly sizable, but not in the same size and the 100-year life as BHP Billiton, which started to be managed in a different way and almost became a sort of a robotic type of organization that manufactured commodities, that wants to manufacture commodities in a way that's different from we know as miners, and looking at a horizon that is so far ahead, you didn't have to worry too much about building them up. So you can get so much out of BHP Billiton. These assets require more attention, but when you bring that management and you give them the empowerment, they can get a lot more out of those assets by just focusing on them. And this is what the advantage is with South32, which is good for South Africa, because we needed more attention to manganese. We've got a fantastic manganese resource in South Africa, and this is very much part of that. But the manganese price has really tanked, and to just keep your existing businesses going requires a lot more management attention. But because of the size and magnitude of BHP Billiton, the sort of quality they went for, if you do give that extra attention, you get more out of it. And that's what I think the analysts are bargaining, they're betting on.
What are some of the things that could impact on South32's aluminium, manganese and coal businesses?
See, it's again, we're looking at the supply side that, extra management attention can increase that supply side. So what about the demand side? Now, if you get a country like Indonesia suddenly lifting the ban on alumina, or, it can have an impact on the business. Already, we were expecting a sort of a better price from aluminium, but because of suddenly finding more aluminium than we knew about. That price is moderating. I think the manganese price can be hit by China, not doing as much as it used to, and maybe not doing as much as people even think it'll do in steel production. And coal as well. China, is it going to buy as much coal? So these are things that are the risks, but you've got to weigh them up, and most people seem to do the weighing up of the risks and started to favour South32. And we saw that share lifting, whereas the BHP Billiton share fell. It fell by more than South32 lifted,
Rose,
according to Financial Times. If you did the calculation, which I didn't do, they said the sort of value of the lift of South32 wasn't as great as that value of the fall of BHP Billiton. So there's a bit of a loss there. There's a bit of a deficit between the two. But I'm sure that if we look longer term, as miners should, things will straighten themselves out. But in the meantime, BHP Billiton has come under a lot of unexpected sort of headwind, both in terms of inquiries into tax in Australia, sort of inquiries in the United States, which they're just coming out of. Serious attacks on them in Australia. There's almost a lobby now wanting an inquiry into iron ore production, because they feel that this is a national patrimony, and if you sort of overproduce in a way that is uncompetitive, you push everyone else out. They don't want that to happen anymore. They also don't want to have a repeat of such a collapse in the price, where I think the Treasurer, Australian Treasurer, has had quite a bit to say, because having to do his budget with such a low iron ore price, he realised that the country is dependent on it. So it has serious social impacts, and there are fingers being pointed at BHP Billiton. They've started to defend themselves quite well, but I think the attacks are being done by some seasoned campaigners. Andrew Forrest, he's quite charismatic, and when it comes to doing this sort of lobbying, he seems to be quite well equipped, and he gets a hearing. And so that's the sort of pressure they've come under now. South32's got themselves away from that, which is quite an advantage for them. And I do see the relief on the faces of the local executives here. I think it must have been quite traumatic, imagining how is this going to go on the stock exchange, and suddenly there's smiles abroad.
And on that note, how has the share been trading these last few days?
Well, it's been phenomenal. It lifted on the second day. The second day of trade was really strong. You saw it lift 14% in Australia. It even lifted 10% in London, where people thought it was going to fall, because there was a sort of an obligation because of the index weightings for people to sell off. But despite that, overall, it lifted in London. And then if you took the 2 percentages in South Africa, South Africa was sort of quick off the mark, with a sort of a 3% uplift quite fast. And then the next day, another nearly 7%. So overall in South Africa, it's also been close to 10%. And I think that they got a good deal in South Africa. The listing on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange was a great affair. And I must say that you've got to take your hat off to the people of Johannesburg Stock Exchange. They really do a good job for South Africa. And it was really noticeable in that listing. And you could see that the people appreciated sort of status that they were given on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. And that had an impact on the share uplift, which was fairly rapid.
Well, that's good news, especially if you have South32 shares.
Yes, yeah. I think it's people are happy to have those. It could be a sort of a repeat, perhaps, maybe not to the same extent, of the, when there was a spin out of Sibanye gold from Goldfields. Everybody imagined that the Goldfields share would lift and that Sibanye share would struggle to lift. Well, the complete opposite happened. Sibanye just kept going and rising and rising and rising, and Goldfields struggled, and it hasn't recovered fully from it. So, you can sort of think, well, you're going to release yourself of a burden, but suddenly people take the spin-off is something that they can understand more, probably because it's smaller, etc., and they can back it, and then you could have trouble with your big monolith. We haven't seen it to the same extent yet, but early signs are that it went in the same direction. BHP Billiton fell, South32 rose. You have a situation in South Africa where Goldfields fell and Sibanye just never stopped rising. And perhaps it's a bit of a trend with these spin-offs, and it'll be interesting to see whether that happens in the platinum sector. They're also thinking of a demerger possibility, Anglo-American Platinum, rather than trading off their various assets, deep-level assets, by selling them off in a sort of a private treaty manner. They're looking to packaging them into a separate entity and listing that on the stock exchange. So perhaps it's a trend that people think seems to work.
Well, we'll wait and see.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Martin.
Great pleasure, Shannon.
That's it for today. Join us again next week for more news analysis on South Africa's mining industry.